Good morning and welcome. I'm Elaine Verveer and I serve on the board of the National Endowment for Democracy. And I want to welcome all of you who've joined us here at the NED and all of you who are joining us virtually from all around the world. Welcome to each and every one of you for this very important conversation on human rights in Crimea, consequences of Russia's all-out aggression. And for those of you on social media, we encourage you to participate in today's discussion by using the hashtag NEDEMOCRACY, NE-Democracy. A little complicated, but I'm sure everybody will manage. In early 2014, Russia invaded and shortly thereafter annexed the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine. This act of unprovoked aggression violated the territorial integrity and independence of Ukraine. Of course, we see a pattern in all of this today of Russian aggression as it continues in today's brutal attack on Ukraine's very existence. Perhaps we can say, in the beginning, it was Crimea. Russia initially sought to hide its involvement in Crimea. The little green men, unmarked Russian soldiers whose identity Russian officials sought to conceal, executed Russia's takeover. Putin had claimed that Russia had no plans to annex Crimea, nor to invade Ukraine. When they did admit the presence of Russian troops, it was justified on the basis of some non-existent threat to the lives of the Crimean people. Among the terrible consequences of Russia's takeover, there have been massive violations of human rights, multiple reports of documented cases of torture, arbitrary detention, kidnappings, forced disappearances, persecution of the indigenous people of Crimea, the Tatars, and so much more. As the title of today's program notes, the human rights violations in Crimea are nothing less than the consequences of Russia's all-out aggression. Prior to Russia's brazen annexation of Crimea, 500,000 people from all walks of life across the generations from all regions of Ukraine came together in 2014 in the Revolution of Dignity on the Maidan. They came to protest the authoritarian rule and massive corruption of the Yanukovych government. He was ultimately overthrown, and the Maidan catalyzed the development of a strong civil society in Ukraine. Putin's response to this outpouring of citizen activism was to seize Crimea and shortly thereafter to invade Ukraine in the east, before launching the full-scale war on Ukraine earlier this year. You see the pattern in all of this. Joining us today are two absolutely remarkable women of Ukraine. Like so many Ukrainian women, they have been providing exceptional leadership on the front line. Currently, they are both representatives of the government of Ukraine, but both bring to their official positions a record of purposeful civil society engagement and a very strong commitment to human rights. The NED has been a proud partner of Ukraine's civil society organizations, independent media, and human rights, and we are proud to have these two Ukrainian leaders with us today. Earlier this year, President Zelensky appointed Tamila Tasheva to the position of permanent representative of the President of Ukraine in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea. Tamila, perhaps you can come up so everybody can see you. She was, prior to that, deputy permanent representative. In 2013, like so many of her fellow Ukrainians, she took part in the Revolution of Dignity against the Yanukovych regime. A year later, she became co-founder and chair of Crimea SOS and successfully implemented a series of civic initiatives promoting the culture of the Crimea Tatars and working to develop civil society in Ukraine. Crimea SOS has grown into a wide volunteer network. Following the annexation of Crimea, she collected evidence on human rights violations against the indigenous people, evidence of disappearances and abuse. And she is a human rights activist and Crimean Tatar young generation leader, and we're thrilled she's with us today. Welcome, Tamila. Maria Tomak is the head of the Crimea Platform Department at the mission of the President of Ukraine in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, which acts as the national office of the Crimean Platform. She was previously a human rights activist, journalist, researcher, and the coordinator and co-founder of the Media Initiative for Human Rights. During the Euromaidan, she volunteered for the Euromaidan SOS initiative and later moved on to actively participate in documenting human rights violations in eastern Ukraine and Russia's seizure of Crimea. And she shared those reports to the Ukrainian society, with Ukrainian society, and to the international community in very consequential work. In the summer of 2014, she started dealing with cases of Ukrainian citizens illegally arrested by Russia and coordinated the Let My People Go campaign to free them. She's a co-founder of the NGO Media Initiative for Human Rights and has co-authored several documentaries dedicated to the bloodiest day of the Euromaidan and the war in Donbass. So welcome to you too, Maria. The Kremlin continues its militarization of Crimea, repressing the people and using Crimea today to support the war against the rest of Ukraine. Maria and Tamila have been advocating for the defense of their country across Europe and today in the United States as well, and reminding their audiences that Crimea is serving as a base for Putin's efforts to erase Ukraine's identity. It's being used by Putin as a Russian base for launching military operations to occupy other regions of Ukraine, including nearby Kherson. So the war began in Crimea and continues all across Ukraine today. And now to our discussion. It is my pleasure always to be able to turn the program over to Damon Wilson, the president and CEO of the NED, who will moderate the conversation between Tamila and Maria. Take it away, Damon.
Ambassador Verveer, thank you. Thank you. I think everyone in this audience knows it's such an honor to have Ambassador Verveer Milan on the board of the endowment. She has been a champion of so many causes, but particularly a champion of a free, independent, sovereign Ukraine. So thank you for kicking us off today. Welcome, Tamila, welcome, Maria. It is such an honor to have you here in Washington. Milan framed it right, that part of what we're doing is talking about Crimea in the midst of this war to underscore Crimea's centrality as an issue. This war began in Crimea 8 years ago, and it's a place where a majority voted for Ukrainian independence back in 1991. Our support, your work, needs to be central to our response to Russia's all-out invasion of Ukraine, not seen as an afterthought or buried among the headlines, but a central part of our response on how we support indigenous populations in Crimea, which we will talk about. And as Milan said, we have two remarkable guests. This meeting is really a follow-up of a meeting that I had the privilege to have with Tamila Tasheva and Maria Tomak when I was in Kyiv in early May. Among their first meetings, after having returned to Kyiv to their offices, we had a great conversation at the time, and it's really an honor to reciprocate by welcoming you here. But I also see this as a follow-up for the endowment, which has had a long-standing commitment to the Crimean cause of democracy and freedom. Barbara Haig's with us. She was just sharing photographs of our hosting of Mustafa Jamilov, who in Washington, well before when she had early pictures, but was honored in 2018 with the Democracy Award here at the Endowment. Really our highest honor to recognize the importance and the leadership, his leadership, someone 15 years in prison, 300 days of hunger strike. We've just finished our Democracy Awards this year where we honored Ukrainian civil society, so it's a good bookend. Finally, this is a follow-up, as we've talked about, to my own trip to Crimea in 2007, where we've discussed one day you will show me a free Crimea and I can return with you. But Tamila, let me start with you. Please tell us a little bit about how you see the situation in Crimea. How has it been impacted by the war? And I think you're right, both just make sure your mic is on with that the green button pushed. But please, Tamila, over to you.
Thank you, and I greet all of you, all honorable colleagues, and many thanks for Ned for having us today and for organizing this meeting, and for US government, of course, and US citizens for all support of Ukraine. It's very important for us. We see it from Ukraine, and for all this support, because it's US it's closest our partner, and all our people understand it. Crimea is occupied by Russians during 8 years, and really war is not start at 24th of February this year, but 8 years ago, this occupation of Crimea. And during these 8 years, Russian Federation colonized Crimea, do a military base from Crimea, and all different infrastructure projects, for example, which they do in Crimea, now is works on full-scale invasion against Ukraine. This highway Tavrida, Kerch Bridge, all military personnel in Crimea now is works on occupying new territories. And of course, they militarize thinking of people, they brainwash minded of our people in Crimea during 8 years. But what we see now in Crimea after 24th of February, it's a high level of propaganda in Crimea. It's even in kindergartens, in schools, in different social spheres, and of course, it's they persecute people in Crimea even more. Because of course they persecute people, Ukrainians, Crimean Tatars, during 8 years. But after 24th of February, it's a huge number of new cases of persecutions of our people. We now only cases from on the top of iceberg. But it's 100 cases which we are now from civil society organizations from Crimea, or who work in mainland of Ukraine, or from people who now are persecuting Crimea. We have many communications with our people and with activists, anti-war activists in Crimea. And they persecute them according to newly established legislation in Russian Federation. They labeled them as, of course, as extremists now also. And of course, in Crimea, we have ongoing court hearings and processes against Crimean Tatars, especially. And for this moment, we have 138 criminal cases against Crimeans, Ukrainian citizens. 105 cases are Crimean Tatars. And we know that during these 8 years, they labeled Crimean Tatars as extremists and terrorists, and used extremist and terrorist legislation against Crimean Tatars or Ukrainians. And of course, all these persecutions are ongoing in Crimea. Of course, they use Crimea as a base for occupying new territories and in southern part of Ukraine. And Crimea have a huge role on this full-scale invasion against Ukraine.
Thank you, Tamila. I want to just continue this point with Maria. Give us a sense of these. You've talked about the political persecutions, how you see the human rights abuses in Crimea, and what has changed since the war. Before the war, many in our audience would have followed the case of Oleg Sentsov, the filmmaker. We're joined by PEN America here in our audience right now, which is advocating for a journalist, Vladislav Yesipinko, who's been tortured, imprisoned. What's the nature of the political prosecutions that you're seeing since the war began? How much is it happening in Crimea? We have the case of filtration in other parts of Ukraine of people being taken back to Russia. How much of this is happening in Crimea? How much of these folks are being taken to Russia?
Thank you, Damon, and thank you, Ambassador.
Just let's make sure your microphone's on.
Sorry,
Terrific.
forgot about that. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. Thank you, Damon, for your question, and thank you, Ambassador, for your excellent speech in the beginning. So I would like start by saying that it has become even more challenging to get the information from inside Crimea after February 24. So it wasn't easy before that, and I would say that we received all of that information because of courageousness of the group of people who provided us this information on the cost of their freedom very often. But now it has become even more complicated because people are afraid to talk, especially to us as the representatives of the state, but even to NGOs. And also partly because Russia has adopted even more restrictive legislation after the beginning of this full-scale invasion. In particular, the legislation of the so-called fake news. So when people can receive like 7 years of imprisonment for telling the truth, basically. In the meantime, the representatives of Russian state, for instance, in the Security Council of the UN, they're like, they're brutally lying, you know.
That's right.
Then they imposed this new legislation, adopted new legislation on the so-called discreditation of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. And most of those cases that were mentioned by Tamila are exactly the cases of the persecution of people for the so-called discreditation of the Russian army. So it's complicated to get the information about new political persecutions. It's complicated. It's even more complicated to get the information about those illegal, forceful displacement that takes place to Crimea or via Crimea of Ukrainian citizens. For instance, people who stay, Ukrainian citizens who stay in the shelters that were created by the occupying authorities in Crimea, they are not allowed to talk to anyone outside. And these so-called shelters, they're guarded by the security service of Russia. And even for those people whom we are in touch with within Crimea, I mean, they cannot get access to those people in order to ask them how was this filtration happening when they tried to enter Crimea, how they escaped, and so on and so forth. But generally, I would say that we had bad situation with human rights in Crimea prior to the all-out aggression, but now new challenges arrived. And these challenges are related, first of all, to this forced displacement of Ukrainian citizens. It relates not only to just civilian people who try to flee the war, and they have to go via the occupied territories because they cannot access the government-controlled areas because Russia restricts that access. But also, it's an awful thing that we have not seen in Crimea since 2014, when people just disappear. Because that was the wave of these enforced disappearances in 2014, mostly when the occupation started. Then Russia tried to pretend that they do everything according to the law, to the Russian law. But although there was political persecutions, but it was allegedly lawful. But now we can see that this brutality returned, and those activists who are kidnapped in Kherson region, they are transferred to Crimea, and they are held in various places of detention, in pretrial detention center, but also in some other places that are not aimed for this, for holding people, basically, for keeping people. And they are tortured there, interrogated, et cetera, et cetera. So I would say that the situation has become even more worse. But I would like maybe to say here, because I think it's important that you started with this, providing us this broader picture. You even mentioned the 1991 and the Maidan. And I think it's important to say that, first of all, Ukraine resists, and you cannot see any voices, hear any voices now in Ukraine suggesting to give up to Russia, or to make any compromises with Russia on Crimea, on Donbass, or whatever. So it's very important. And I think it's very important now to say that, of course, we can only suggest how would it happen. But I think that now the situation in Kherson, the newly occupied territories in southern Ukraine, with the brutal oppression of any sort of resistance, with the brutal occupation of this territory, with hundreds of people kidnapped, tortured, and killed people, show us that in Crimea in 2014, it was not the choice of people. It was the military operation of Russia, and it was the occupation. And people did not choose to be a military base for Russia. But that's something that goes by default with the occupation. And now these people they're living in the military base, and it's not their choice. So it's just important to understand this.
I think that's so important, Maria. We have seen that in Crimea. We've seen it in South Ossetia. You've talked about the impact in Kherson, so I wanted to ask both of you. In some respects, after the Russian objectives to take Kyiv, to topple the Ukrainian government, were foiled, we saw them sort of retrench back into the 2014 concept, Novorossiya, but really part of it may have been driven by Crimea. How to connect the land bridge to Crimea, how to connect water supplies to Crimea, how to incorporate Crimea more into Russia by occupying parts of Zaporizhzhia, Kherson. Talk a little bit about how you see, I think if I'm not mistaken, even some of your operations were based in Kherson to be forward deployed to Crimea. How has this occupation of Kherson, Zaporizhzhia impacted the link with Crimea, the ability to reach people? What's the interplay between a Russian strategy of now trying to replicate what they did in Crimea and Kherson? Give us a sense of the impact of this on those two regions. And you can leave it on.
Yes, yes, thank you. Yes, actually, our office, mission of the President of Ukraine, after 2014, displaced from Simferopol to Kherson, and then we opened office in 2019 in Kyiv also. And now our office two our offices in Simferopol and Kherson under occupation.
Two of your offices are occupied
yes.
now.
Two offices occupied, and in middle of March, office in Kherson are hacked by Russian soldiers. I have more than our staff employees in Kherson who stay 3 months in Kherson on the occupying authorities and power. Now they displaced and flee Kherson region and work in Kiev. And we have a lot of information actually about Kherson. Of course, it's not our mandate, but we monitor situation in Kherson because it's really on a borderline, and a lot of services for our people from Crimea, they get these services in Kherson, near checkpoints. In 2019, President Zelensky and Office of President established and rebuilt these checkpoints on Chongar and Kalanchak. And when Russia starts this new invasion, full-scale invasion against Ukraine, they destroyed these checkpoints. And now our people don't have possibility to have these services from Ukrainian government. Because you understand that when Ukrainians live in temporarily occupied territory of Crimea Peninsula, they need services from our Ukrainian government, and ID certificate, birth certificate, death certificate, and another sort of medical care. And a lot of these people travel a lot in mainland of Ukraine. A lot of our people live in a near border, near Genichsk and Novoalexeyevka, Crimean Tatars people. And now they also persecute our people in Novoalexeyevka and Genichsk. After full-scale invasion, more than 70% of people, Crimean Tatar people, displaced and flee Kherson and Genichsk regions. Because
so you said 70% of those who had already been displaced to Kherson are now displaced again.
Yes, before they displaced before in 2014,
right.
or historically live in Kherson region.
Yes.
Because when Crimean Tatars is come back from Central Asia, they choose to live near Crimea because in the ends of 1980s, they don't have possibility to live in Crimea.
Right,
you understand it. Yes, and of course we monitor situation in Kherson, and Russian Federation use Crimea to newly occupied territories in Kherson and Zaporizhia. They used Russian occupation authorities who work in Crimea now to occupy new territories. This we say gauleiters actually. Aksionov, Konstantinov, Razvazhayev, they every week came to Kherson region, discuss with these occupants or collaborants situation in Kherson region. Even they organize new media in Kherson region because they clean up all Ukrainian media from Kherson. Ukrainian media, of course.
Right.
They clean up all civil rights activities in Kherson region and clean up people, unfortunately, who resist in Kherson. And many of these people who resist during this full-scale invasion after 24th of February and resist against Russians now in basements. And they killed them, tortured them, kidnapped them, transferred from, which is Maria mentioned, from Kherson region to Crimea. They stolen our grain, Ukrainian grain, and transferred this grain to Crimea. to close ports on Black Sea. Crimea have a huge role in this war and in new occupation of new territories in southern part of Ukraine.
So Maria, let me ask you a little bit about what do you see as what are the lessons that both the Russians and Ukrainians have taken away from 2014? We're reading a lot. Are the Russians trying to replicate the consolidation of Crimea in Kherson? Is this what they're drawing from that? And for Ukrainians, we're reading about a counterattack as well. Resistance, in 2014 was a painful time when, with a lot of international advice, there wasn't a reaction to the annexation and occupation. What lessons have Ukrainians and Russians drawn from that, and how do you see that playing out in southern Ukraine now?
First of all, so we can see pretty much the same playbook in Kherson region now, in newly captured territories, as it was in Crimea and in Donbass, by the way. So one of the first things that Russia does, they do exactly the cleanup. But not only those people who are very much pro-Ukrainian or representatives of the security service of Ukraine, law enforcement, that is, I would say, natural for the occupying forces. But what they do, they target civil activists, they target journalists, they target those people who support democracy. I think it's very important to understand. It's not only about Russia fighting for territory, it's Russia fighting against the liberal democratic world. And they try to erase Ukraine, and they try to erase everyone who supports the open world, the democracy, the liberal values. So that's why for people in those occupied territories, it's not about, the choice within two countries, like either Ukraine or Russia, or, it's about they choose, not choosing even, but it's about living in democracy. It's imperfect. I realize that. For years, I've been the civil society activist. I know that Ukraine needs more changes, reforms, etc. But it's not comparable with Russia, which is absolutely authoritarian and, according to the definition of Timothy Snyder, a fascist state now. So, yes, and so this playbook is just the same, and in the nearest time, Russia might want to conduct a sort of referendum, which will not be a referendum, obviously, but they will pretend it's a referendum, as they did in Crimea again and in eastern part of Ukraine, so that somehow to legitimize again the occupation of Kherson region. And as for the lessons, I think it's really something very interesting because, of course, now we understand, we did understood it previously, but of course, the reaction of the international community was not sufficient. On one hand, we had all these political statements and resolutions about the territorial integrity of Ukraine, which was important, and the acknowledgement that Crimea is occupied. But when you look at the business, it was business as usual. You had this Nord Stream 2 stuff and all the other sorts of cooperation with Russia within this real politics stuff. And that's why now we have this, shock therapy, so to say, because now we have this crisis with fossil fuels and everyone is afraid that everything will be just collapsed because everything is so much dependent on Russian fossil fuels. But why there was no, very strategic and step-by-step policies since at least 2014 to refuse from Russian fossil fuels? That's a huge question, why it wasn't done. Although there were all these resolutions and all these, concerns about the Ukrainian territorial integrity. But I think it's also important to say that we, also with the support of the US government, US people, and the West, so to say, the collective West, we had a huge way and huge path starting from 2014. When this new Russian offensive started, we had an army already. It's very important. And I think that's one of the answers to the question why people so much resist in Kherson region, in Zaporizhia region, in other regions, because they feel this, someone is behind their back. The army, the government that gained the support of the people, the president who did not flee, who stayed in the country, although, we know this story. And also, Ukrainian state and society became much more strength,
That's right.
We had some reforms, again, lots of issues, but we had this path. So therefore, people feel that they have to defend it because the alternative is really awful.
Maria, I think that's such an important point. In 2014, Ukrainian civil society was focused on what was happening with Yanukovych and a leadership vacuum where no leadership, civil society focused in one way. The Russians moved at a weak moment and took advantage of that. And I think what you've shown is that with leadership, both in civil society, with leadership in government, with leadership from President Zelensky, that reaction has been completely different. It is a challenge. We've talked a little bit about how you communicate, how you stay in touch with, how you send messages that you have not forgotten, that you are advocating for the people of Crimea as well as the newly occupied territories. It's gotten tougher as we see what the Russians are doing to control the information environment. So how do you communicate? How do you stay in touch with? How do you send messages for those that remain in Crimea?
Yes, thank you for the questions, because it's really real challenge for us as a government institution, but not only for government institution, even for civil society organizations and human rights organizations, because now we don't have independent media in Crimea. They clean up this media in 2014 and 15. But now we have in Crimea civil rights journalists. They also persecute by Russians, and I know a lot of numbers of names: Server Mustafayev, Osman Arif Mimetov, Siran Saliyev, and other names who now persecute. Or Vladislav Yesipenko, who work in Radio Free Liberty, and now in a prison also. That's and right. He arrested 1.5 years ago. Of course, now we understand that Crimea is like a gray zone for all world. But our institutions and civil organizations try to have these communications and connect with our people. I am originally from Crimea. I'm Crimean Tatar. Of course, I have a lot of my own contacts with our people. And as I know, many people after 24 February say we waiting for Ukrainian army and Ukrainian government. They understand that it's a chance for Ukraine now, even after this destroyed our cities, thousands of killing people now in Ukraine after full-scale invasion. They understand that it's a chance for deoccupying Crimea. And why we are here, why we are work a lot with our international partners inside Ukraine, and every day communicate and highlight issue of Crimea, Crimean Tatars. Of course, we have our Facebook page, we have our website, we communicate via email or even hotline, but it's very complicated for people because internet is under control of Russians, of course. But they used this VPN and other services for get information from Ukraine. They use some Telegram channels, and shall establish Telegram channels share information from Crimea also. And every day I have messages from one woman from Sevastopol, and on every day she sent us messages about missile strikes from Sevastopol, for example. Mm-hmm. And every day she said, "Oh, we apologize. We don't do it, but Russian occupying power and army do missile strikes to Ukraine. 1, 2, 3, and she told us. Of course, our people communicate with us, but it's really dangerous for them.
Right.
And very important that our people are waiting us. When we have a communication with President, he asked me and Maria if our army came to Crimea on the borderline with Crimea, how Ukrainians, Crimeans meet us
right.
with flowers or not. And very important for us, for the government, to have communication with our people, to get them services, to send for Crimea messages about if you do not do any war crimes in Crimea, if you live in occupied territories and survive, mm-hmm. You don't have any responsibility for that.
Right.
And we send these messages.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, we do after the occupation of Crimea. Of course, we do some illustration campaigns. Of course, we understand it. Some amnesty campaigns. Of course, and now we prepared it. We do not wait when Crimea is deoccupied, but we do real steps for the occupation in arming, in military measures, yes, and of course in different spheres, and of course in a legal sphere also.
Tamila, thank you for that. It is horrific to see how Crimea is being used as the base to attack Ukraine, to control waterways in the Black Sea, to impact the grain shipments out of the country. I want to turn to the audience for a question shortly, but let me come back to you, Maria. First, you did refer to your meeting recently with President Zelensky. He helped sort of put together, you are the the permanent representative of the presidents for Crimea. Maria, you've been helping to build the Crimea Platform. You've put together and rolled out this deoccupation reintegration strategy. Talk to us a little bit about what you're trying to achieve with the Crimea Platform, what some of your priorities are in line with President Zelensky's support for the deoccupation strategy.
I should say that Crimea Platform has several dimensions. It's an external track, so to say, and internal work. The internal work was also described to the big extent by Tamila. As for the external track, it's pretty much the mandate of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine as their key agency in Ukraine who deals with the external issues. And the first step for that was in the previous year, almost 1 year ago, when the summit of the Crimea Platform was conducted. And actually, I think that if you look at the Russia's reaction to any activities of Ukraine related to Crimea at the UN, for instance, they really get nervous when you talk about Crimea. No other issue makes them so nervous as Crimea, because it's really important for Putin's, this whole mythology of Russian Empire and then USSR, and so it's really important for him personally. And that's why I think we even talk a lot with colleagues pretty often that the Crimea platform might be one of the reasons, at least one of the reasons, behind this new Russian offensive. Because Russia understood that Ukraine will not give up on Crimea, we will not refuse from Crimea, and that we try to gather our allies and all the other parties who were maybe not so convenient or had doubts around this Crimean issue. So therefore, there was this Crimea platform, like international dimension, and throughout the year, also the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine and we tried to support this attention and this buzz around Crimea via various activities online. Unfortunately, first of all, online ones. And now we are talking about the next steps, although, all these horrible events in Ukraine now, and every day we have shellings and, just like on these days, the Chasiv Yar, more than 40 people are currently, we know that they were killed during this attack, and this happens every day. But Ukraine thinks that still it's important to continue to talk about Crimea, and therefore there will be some events conducted this year as well. I am not authorized to announce them. It will be done by the president himself or by the office of the president, but I can assure you and everyone that it will be there.
Thank
we will continue this work.
Thank you for sharing that. Let me turn and ask if there's a question from our audience here, please. Zach will bring you a microphone, and please introduce yourself to our colleagues and ask a question.
I am Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. One of the things we wondered with Cuba was why Castro never held a really free election. He would have won, and in so doing would have shut the United States up permanently. In a like manner, we have to ask if the referendum in Crimea had been a real referendum instead of the bogus thing the Russians delivered, how would that vote have gone? In the intelligence community, we looked at this, and it wasn't good news. Chances were excellent that, in fact, a free referendum would have gone the exact same way that the bogus referendum had gone. That is, of course, back in 2014. So I have to ask that question. If we're looking to a final solution to this conflict, do we offer Crimea some sort of Northern Ireland-style serious autonomy? Or do we recognize that the transfer in 1954 was something less than legitimate?
Let me ask, is there another question that I can also bring up to them at the same time? Another question? All right, then you're up, Tamila and Maria.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Actually, very important to say that during all independence of Ukraine, Russian Federation work closely in Crimea. Russian Federation support newspapers in Crimea, support some movements in Crimea. But very important to say, it's a real myth that Crimea is real pro-Russians. I have only one example. In 2010, we have elections in Ukraine and in Crimea also. And the most pro-Russian political party in Crimea Русское единство, Russian unity or unity, have only 3% of voting people. They have only 4 mandates in Crimean parliament from 100 seats in Crimean parliament. Very important to say that Crimean Tatars really not vote and even don't go to this illegal referendum. And Crimean Tatars, it's near 15% of people. But not only Crimean Tatars. We have a lot of, and most people who live in Crimea, even on the 2014, are pro-Ukrainian. Of course, they support these Russian organizations and do some activities in Crimea in 2014. But resistance in Crimea, even in 2014, in the end of February 2014, at 26th of February, it's amazing. And if now we even not talking about to organize a referendum in Crimea after during this time, yes, before the occupation. Why? Because Russian Federation colonized Crimea during 8 years. According to information of experts, near 500,000 people, or even more, came to from Russian Federation to Crimea, and it's newly colonized territory now. But they push our people from Crimea, and near 100,000 people flee Crimea after 2014. And we understand it's we even not talking about referendum. And of course, very important to say that Crimean Tatars people, as an indigenous people of Ukraine, and according to newly established law, Ukrainian law, we have 3 indigenous people in Ukraine. It's Crimean Tatars, Karims, and Krimchaks. And we discussed on government level issue of Crimean Tatars and their право на самовизначення, rights for self-determinations in Crimea, but in borders of Ukraine. And of course, we're fighting for Crimea, and we really don't have any compromises about our territorial integrity. And it's very important. We don't have any scenario and other scenarios. We only must to deoccupy our territory in different ways, of course, and using different instruments, of course, but first of all, political and diplomatic way, of course, but we don't need any another referendums. And this referendum, which we have in 2014, it's a really fake referendum. Under guns, under military forces of Russian Federation, and of course we don't recognize it.
You know, I might just add, and then I'm going to ask you a question, Maria, here, use the prerogative of the moderator. We have a whole series of cases, some historic, I won't get into, but from 1991 in the referendum, an overwhelming majority of folks voted for independence, including in Crimea. We saw in 2008, when NATO failed to conclude a membership action plan for Ukraine, the Americans and Ukrainians agreed on a strategic partnership that included the opening of an American presence post in Crimea, which was agreed but never implemented, in part because there were already very clear indications of what Russia was doing in a hybrid manner to provoke a sense of dissolution of separatism. And what we witnessed in 2014 was not the empowerment of local elites, but if you looked in Crimea, if you looked in Donbass, those that were killed, displaced from power, they weren't people sent in from Kyiv. They were the local political actors and elites that were displaced and were moved out and paid the heaviest price to make room for what had up to that point been fringe actors who were empowered in this 2014. Not to mention, as you said, we have seen, I think, 150 anti-war protests since the latest full-scale invasion began. A slew of sales from Russian security forces of their properties in Crimea, interestingly enough. And finally, I think you importantly point to the indigenous people. And we've seen a track record in Russia of indigenous people being used both as what is called electoral sultanates, often low turnout in elections, is an area for a higher proportion of electoral fraud from central authorities, but also a disproportionate use of these ethnic minorities, indigenous populations as cannon fodder in Russia's battles and Russia's wars we see in Ukraine today. Let's close, if I can come back to you, Maria, with a little bit of your sharing with us. What do you need from the international community? What are your priorities, both for this visit, but more broadly? How can the international community help?
Thank you. As we say oftentimes with Tamila, we're like formerly human rights defenders, and it's not easy for us to ask for weapons, but we do need arming. Yes, it's sad to say this, but that's the only way that we can defend human rights in Ukraine, is to make Russian Federation get out of occupied territories. So that, I would say, that is the main thing. And our colleagues here can confirm that Svetlana Valko, she's representing the IPHR, and her parents are currently in the occupation in Kherson region, in Nova Kakhovka. And she was telling us yesterday how people were happy to hear the shellings and the bombings in Kherson region, because for them it means that Ukrainian army is close and that they're going to be deoccupied. You can imagine how people are feeling. And this happens also thanks to the support provided by the US and the US Army. So I would not pretend here that we're all for peace, of course, but the peace can be achieved via the arming also that is provided by the international community. I just want to be clear about that. And also, what we also try to say here is that we need to designate Russian Federation as a terrorist state, which is not some political statement, but of course it leads to some legal consequences from the side of the US state and all the other international community. It's important, and again, it's not just political statement, but if you look at those recent shellings that were done by Russia, Kremenchuk, where the shopping mall was targeted and many people died, including children, Chasiv Yar, when many people died, it's all over Ukraine. So that's also we need. And also the designation sanctions against Russian banks, that's really something that financially support all this system. And I would also like to say one thing before Tamila will add more recommendations maybe or requests, because it's very important also to feel the vibe of how Ukrainian society feels this war, is to say that many our human rights defenders went as volunteers to fight as well. These people are totally peaceful, but they have no other, they cannot invent any other ways to support now human rights and peace in Ukraine other than go and fight. And I think one of the prominent examples is Maxim Butkevich. I would describe him, he's pro-peace activist, And now he went to the army, not because he changed his views, but because he's a person of conscience. And unfortunately, a few weeks ago, he was captured by Russian army, and now he's a prisoner of war. And we just want to, to sound his name, to draw attention to his fate, Maxim Butkevich. And we're really afraid for his life and health, because I don't think that Russia might treat him well because of all of his activities. He's a LGBTI activist. He's an activist who supported and defended a lot migrants and refugees. So he is a really brilliant human rights defender. And just for you to know that he is in captivity, and many other human rights defenders really fight in this war, as well as, by the way, Crimean Tatars, which is important.
Thank you. We're going to wrap. Do you want one quick final word?
Yes, many thanks. Very important to always, at every day, highlight Crimea issue. And Crimea resist, actually. And I must say today also another name, is Nariman Jalal. He's first deputy head of Majlis of Crimean Tatar people. He arrested after Crimea Platform in beginning of September last year. Today we have court hearings in Crimea, and many people who came to these court hearings now arrested. And one of the human rights activist and defender, Rolan Osmanov, and he gave us a lot of information of human rights abuses in Crimea. And very important, every day highlight these names, because because we have these persons who resist during 8 years of occupation of Crimea. We know information from Crimea, and we have a chance to talking here in DC and highlight situation in Crimea. Because if we don't have such a persons, don't have any information from Crimea, and it's really a gray zone.
Tamila, Maria, I think you've ended on a point that's so important for the conversation, that this isn't some abstract war. These are real people, real leaders and activists, individuals who are paying an extraordinary price. We're following the case of Maxim Butkevich. We've been in touch with his family, so many of the Crimean Tatars that have suffered for trying to give voice to the indigenous. But it's also why we're so honored to have you with us on our stage. Tamila Tasheva and Maria Tomak have been incredible outspoken advocates for Crimea, for the Crimean Tatar cause, and are a good example of what we call here crossovers. Our World Movement for Democracy runs a crossover initiative in which incredible civil society activists take on the mantle of responsibility by moving into positions of governmental responsibility and authority. The two of you have done that in that case. Thank you for your activism. Thank you for your voice. Thank you for your leadership. I want to give a shout out to our own team, Christine Nugent, Tanya Bullock, Asa Ivancheva, Jane Jacobson. We've got Mike Dugan behind the glass back there, Zach Evans, and of course our own board member, Ambassador Milan Verveer, for helping to make this possible. But please join me in thanking Tamila. Thank you, Maria, for being with us here. Thank you.